James Ellis adjusted the chin strap of his bearskin hat as he stood in his post outside Buckingham Palace. The morning air was crisp, but the heavy wool of his ceremonial tunic and the towering black fur on his head made the sweat bead along his back before the tourists even arrived. He had been doing this for years now. Silent, stoic, and perfectly still to most onlookers, he was part of the scenery, another uniformed figure guarding the crown, a relic of tradition more than a man. Children giggled, mothers posed for pictures beside him, and influencers with ring lights and iPhone shoved phones in his face, trying to get a reaction. They rarely did. That was the job, but James was not just a guard. He had served in Afghanistan, had spent nights freezing in a foxhole and days baking in 50-degree heat under enemy fire. Yet, oddly enough, he felt more exposed here, on the gravel path of the Queen's Guard post, than he ever had on the front lines. Here he was mocked, trivialized. He had been part of the British Army for nearly 15 years. The move to ceremonial duty had been something he welcomed at first, a more stable rhythm after years abroad, a chance to be near his aging mother in South London, but he hadn't expected how straining it could be to stand still for hours, muscles aching, joints locking, all while being treated like a wax figure in a theme park. His body hurt always. The weight of the bearskin alone was nearly 4 pounds, and under it he could feel the slight pull in his neck. The boots were polished but unforgiving. Even his rifle, which he held with surgical precision, was low, hollow prop. His entire stance was about discipline and duty. But to many who passed, it was all just a tourist attraction. He remembered one lad, maybe 19, laughing loudly. What a joke. Man just stands there for a living. Bet he thinks he's Rambo. The boy had mimed exaggerated marching steps, drawing laughter from his mates. James didn't flinch. He never did, but he remembered every laugh, every snide comment. Every day someone tried to make him break character, whistling in his ear, clapping in his face, shouting obscenities, and through it all he stood, because he wore the uniform, because someone had to represent dignity, even if dignity itself was becoming unfashionable. The tourists would go back to their hotels, their vlogs, their weekend holidays. James would go back to his barracks, legs swollen, shoulders tight, often in silence. No medals on these streets, no applause, just the sound of shuffling feet and selfie sticks, clicking like sniper triggers. He hadn't lost a limb in Afghanistan, but some days, standing here unmoving, unloved, unnoticed, he felt like he'd lost something else, something slower to bleed, but harder to replace. The square in front of Buckingham Palace was already stirring before 10mm coaches pulled up one after the other, unloading tourists like clockwork. Germans with maps, Americans with GoPros, Japanese school children in matching caps. They clustered around the gates, their excitement bouncing off the metal railings. James Ellis stood at his post, eyes forward, rifle resting against his shoulder with mechanical precision. He could see them from the corner of his eye, the dance of camera lenses and flapping flags, the hum of foreign tongues. Some were respectful, many were not. A teenage girl in a Union Jack hoodie posed beside him, making duck lips. Her boyfriend laughed and said, "Go on, poke him, bet he blinks." She did. He didn't. A man in a Liverpool jersey muttered as he passed, "Get a real job, mate," loud enough to be heard. His partner snorted with laughter. James had heard it all before. "Oi, tin soldier, bet he's got AirPods in. Do you ever blink? Say something if you're useless." One lad tried moonwalking in front of him last week. Another pulled a stupid face while live streaming to his followers. His phone was practically in James's face. They came not to see the guard, but to provoke him, to test the boundaries. It was like theater, only the actors were never allowed to speak. That was the unspoken contract. The guard was silent, immovable, symbolic, and they had free rein. But James wasn't playing a role. He was serving his country. The worst days were when school groups came. Children shouted, threw small coins toward the guards to see if they'd move. Once, someone lobbed a grape. Another time, a crumpled McDonald's wrapper hit James in the leg. He stood through it all. That was the job, but his pride took hits where his body did not. The weight of public misunderstanding pressed on him more than the rifle. What people didn't see were the drills behind closed doors, the pre-dawn inspections, the uniform standards that would make a surgeon's gown look sloppy. They didn't see the boots worn until blisters turned to hardened calluses, the silence maintained even when your nose itched or your back spasmed or someone screamed abuse an inch from your ear. This wasn't just about standing. This was about history, tradition, continuity. It was about the memory of every soldier before him who had stood in the same spot in honor of a nation they believed in, even when that nation laughed at them. At night in the barracks, guards joked to each other. We're the most insulted servicemen in the UK. It was a bitter truth, veiled in gallows humor, but James didn't join to be liked. He joined to serve. Still, as he stood immobile while someone danced provocatively in front of him for their TikTok, he couldn't help but wonder, how long can a man carry respect for a society that refuses to return it? Saturday brought with it a different kind of crowd. Less families, more stag parties and street performers. The energy was louder, brasher, charged with a sort of chaotic glee that made James's stomach tightened as he walked toward his post that morning. He'd barely settled into position when they arrived. A group of young men in sportswear, hoods up despite the spring sun, hanging back at first, observing, "Look at this muppet," one of them muttered, nudging his friend. "Bet he's desperate to scratch his nose. Go on, soldier boy." Yet they circled slowly. At first James thought they might pass on, but one peeled away, stepped close, and said with mock seriousness, "Oi, do you even speak English?" Saturday brought with it a different kind of crowd. Less families, more stag parties and street performers. The energy was louder, brasher, charged with a sort of chaotic glee that made James's stomach tightened as he walked toward his post that morning. He'd barely settled into position when they arrived. A group of young men in sportswear, hoods up despite the spring sun, hanging back at first, observing, "Look at this muppet," one of them muttered, nudging his friend. "Bet he's desperate to scratch his nose. Go on, soldier boy." Yet they circled slowly. At first James thought they might pass on, but one peeled away, stepped close, and said with mock seriousness, "Oi, do you even speak English, mate, or you just built to stand there?" Laughter followed. James didn't move, not an inch. The man leaned in just far enough to stay within legal distance and said quietly, "I fought for this country too. You just do it in a fancy hat, standing like a statue while real men work." James knew this game, provocation, testing limits. Trying to get a reaction that could be filmed, clipped and shared online with a smug caption like "I made the Queen's Guard blink." Still, he didn't move. But another voice entered the picture, this one unfamiliar, foreign, accented, louder. "Why does your country even need this?" A young man said, holding a phone sideways while filming, "You think this scares someone? So old school. Where's the usefulness?" He turned the camera toward James. "You guard a palace with tourists in it. Big man." His friend laughed. "You know what would be funny? If he dropped that gun." "Bade, it's not even loaded." James's fingers tensed slightly around the grip of his rifle. He couldn't speak, couldn't flinch, couldn't defend the years of service, the brothers he'd buried, the lines on his mother's face when he first returned from Helmand. All he could do was stand there while strangers, some born here, others not, tore down the meaning of everything he was taught to protect. Later, during the shift change, he passed another guard, Connor, younger, still idealistic. Connor whispered as they passed, "They were right up in your face. You good?" James nodded once, but inside he wasn't. Not because of the insults, they were nothing new, but because of how casual they'd become, how public the disrespect was now, how accepted. He remembered the funeral of his old mate, Danny, 6 years ago. Full honors, family in tears, school children watching in silence along the street. When the shift ended and the gates closed to tourists, James Ellis walked back to the barracks with the slow, aching gait of a man used to pain that no longer alarms him. The ceremonial uniform came off piece by piece, tunic folded with precision, boots placed neatly, rifle secured. The bearskin finally removed left his scalp sore and sweaty. He changed into civvies, grey hoodie and jeans, and headed for home, a modest flat in Streatham, South London, where the noise of buses never quite faded, even at night. No one on the train recognized him without the uniform. Not that they would have shown recognition even if he wore it. A few glanced at his tired eyes, his calloused hands, and quickly looked away. He was just another middle-aged man on the 738, trying to keep his head down. His building was tired, peeling paint near the entry, a lift that worked when it pleased, and a constant dampness in the hall. As he stepped inside, Mrs. Ozer from the second floor gave him a nod. She never asked what he did, never had to. Her son had served once. The young man from the third floor, however, Kieran grunted something under his breath when James passed. "Bit old for trackies, aren't you?" James paused, turned, and said nothing. Kieran smirked and slammed his door shut. At home, the telly played quietly, mostly for company. He made tea, sat on the edge of the warm sofa, and massaged his left knee, an old injury, one of the souvenirs from Afghanistan that never quite healed. He flipped through the day's post, council letter, supermarket flyer, and an electricity bill. He wasn't sure how he'd cover this month. There were no medals on the wall, no pictures of his days overseas. His mother had kept those until her passing last spring. Now everything from his old life lived in a box under the bed, out of sight, easier that way. He tried to ring his sister but got voicemail again. They hadn't spoken much since the funeral. She didn't understand why he stayed in the service. "You've done your part, James. Why not just move on?" Because there was nothing else, not really. Later that evening, he walked to the corner shop for milk. Two teenagers outside laughed as he passed. "Hey, aren't you that guy who just stands there in the funny hat?" One of them called out. James didn't stop. "Must be a laugh being you." The other said, "Do you blink in your sleep too?" He kept walking. He'd heard worse. The shopkeeper, Mr. Patel, gave him a warm nod. "Still serving, Mr. Rellis." "Still serving," James replied quietly. "You've got discipline. That's something these boys on the street don't understand." James appreciated the words, but they didn't take away the weariness that clung to him like a second skin. Later, lying on his bed, staring at the ceiling, he thought about the boys outside the shop, about Kieran upstairs, about the men shouting at him through their phones. It wasn't the hate that exhausted him. It was the dismissal. He wasn't a statue. He was a soldier. But to the world outside, he was just someone in a fancy costume, wasting his life. On silence, tomorrow, he'd go back to the post, because someone had to stand, even if no one saw why. It was a bank holiday, Monday, sunny, crowded, and chaotic, the kind of day when London felt like it had been handed over entirely to tourists and teenagers on school break. James Ellis stood outside the palace at his usual post. Sweat rolled down the back of his neck beneath the bearskin, his knees already stiff from the hour of stillness, and it wasn't even noon. He focused on his breathing, his posture, his silence. Routine was his anchor. Then came the laughter, loud, sharp, pointed, a pack of young men. Early 20s, loud accents, energy that reeked of mischief. Cameras were out, one held a selfie stick, another was already narrating for his followers. "All right, lads, today we gonna make the statue blink. Let's see what the British Army trains you for." Standing still and looking bored. The others howled with laughter. James remained motionless. They began their performance. One danced in front of him. Inches away, another pulled faces. One crouched behind him, pretending to guard the guard. Then came the shouts. "Oi, robot, bet your gun's full of biscuits. Blink if you're a virgin. Move if you've got no balls." It wasn't even creative anymore. Just noise, just emptiness disguised as humor. Then one of them reached out and flecked the brim of James's bearskin. That was the line. With a swift, trained motion, James stepped forward, bringing the sole of his boot down with force, half-pace, as procedure dictated, and barked in full voice, "Step back from the Queen's Guard." The sound snapped the air like a whip. The crowd fell briefly silent. The lads stumbled back wide-eyed, cameras still rolling, but the moment was already gone. The ringleader, undeterred, turned to his phone and yelled, "Yo!" He moved. He actually shouted, "The statue's broken." Within an hour, the video was online. Within 2, it had gone viral. By dinner, it was trending. Queen's Guard finally loses it. British soldier snaps after being trolled. This dude screamed at me just for joking. What EF? James returned to barracks that evening and was greeted by the smirks of junior guards scrolling on their phones. One of them chuckled nervously, "Mate, you're famous." Another showed him the screen. The video, looped, replayed over and over. His firm step, his command, the reaction. But it wasn't respect, it was ridicule. The comments were worse than the video. He thinks Rambo. Someone's got small man syndrome. Why do we still fund these cosplay parades? This is why no one respects the UK anymore. James turned away. He didn't eat that night. He just sat in his room, staring at the opposite wall, the sound of his own voice from the video echoing in his head. Not because he lost control, but because no one cared that it was provoked, that it was the 100th time. They didn't see the restraint. They only saw a moment that fed a story they already believed. The next morning he received a message from an old army mate. Tom saw the video. "Ain't believe the comments. Keep your chin up, brother. We know it helped a little, but something had broken. Not in his posture, in his trust. He could stand still. He could bear the weight. But how long could he keep doing it for a society that only saw the performance, not the person?" James Ellis sat on the bench outside the barracks, his posture relaxed for the first time in days, but his mind far from still. The viral video hadn't died down. In fact, it had taken on a life of its own, clipped, remixed, overlaid with music, turned into memes. He wasn't a soldier anymore in the eyes of the internet. He was that guard who shouted. It would have been easier if the mockery stayed online, but it didn't. That morning, as he walked through the gates, 2 teenage girls had pointed at him and whispered, giggling. One mimicked his voice, stepped back from the Queen's Guard in a high-pitched parody. Another group of men at a food cart had jeered, "Hey, watch out," he might yell. Even inside the barracks, there was unease, not mockery. No one dared but silence. He was the one who snapped. The others weren't sure whether to pity him or keep their distance. Only a few offered quiet solidarity. His superior officer, Captain Hartley, had called him in 2 days prior. No disciplinary action. James had stayed within regulations, but a stiff warning about optics. "We're under the microscope, Ellis. You acted within protocol, but next time remember, the uniform is bigger than the moment." James had nodded, because what else could he do? But inside he felt humiliated, not by his reaction, but by the public's. By the fact that the moment that took everything he had to hold back was being treated like a joke. No one asked what led to it. No one saw what he endured before that step forward, and perhaps worst of all, he began to question if he had, in fact, done something wrong. That night he went to the corner shop again. Mr. Patel was there, as always, but this time his smile was tighter. "I saw the video," he said, handing over the change. James braced for it, but Patel added, "They don't know what respect is anymore. Ignore them. The country needs men like you, whether it admits it or not." James nodded, quietly grateful, but the words felt distant, as if spoken through glass. Later that week, he received a letter handwritten from a child. "Dear soldier, my name is Jack. I am 9 years old. I saw you on the internet. My dad said people were being mean. I just wanted to say you are very brave. I think you look cool and strong. I want to be like you when I grow up. Thank you for standing there. From Jack." James stared at the letter for a long time. It was just one voice. A child, but it cut through the noise in a way no adult had managed, because it was sincere, because it saw the man, not just the hat. He folded the letter carefully and put it in his drawer. It was the first time in days he felt something other than shame. Still, as he stood the next morning in full uniform, another group approached, laughing, phones out. His chest tightened. He stood firm, silent, staring forward, but inside something had changed. He had begun to wonder not just how long he could endure, but why he should have to at all. It was a grey Thursday afternoon when James Ellis met the man who would remind him why he still stood. The palace courtyard had thinned out. The morning rush of tourists had passed, leaving only scattered visitors and the occasional umbrella bobbing between the columns. James stood at his post, expression-neutral boots planted like roots in the stone. He noticed the man immediately, not because he was loud, but because he wasn't. Older, well into his 70s, the man stood apart from the crowd, no phone in hand, no smirk, just a quiet dignity. He wore a dark blue blazer, a maroon tie, and on his chest a single row of modest medals. His walk had a limp, his eyes had seen war. He stopped a respectful distance from James. He didn't speak, didn't gesture, just stood, hands behind his back, observing. Not the Speckle James realized, but the soldier. They held each other's gaze for a moment, James' eyes behind an unmoving face, the old man soft with memory. Then the man raised his hand in a slow, deliberate salute. James felt it deep in the gut, where memory and duty live. He wanted to return the salute. Regulation said he couldn't. He stood still, but something inside him stirred, something he hadn't felt since the first time he wore the uniform. Respect. A few teenagers nearby started laughing. One elbowed the other and said, "What's Grandad saluting for?" "It's just a man in a funny hat," another snorted. "Maybe he's confused, thinks it's Remembrance Day." The veteran turned toward them. His voice was quiet but firm. "Show some bloody manners." They shrugged him off and wandered away, but the moment lingered. The old man turned back to James and gave a nod that said more than words ever could. Then he walked away that evening. James sighed out of his shift and changed in silence. But instead of heading straight home, he walked, uniform, folded under his arm, boots in his bag, until he reached Whitehall. It was a grey Thursday afternoon when James Ellis met the man who would remind him why he still stood. The palace courtyard had thinned out. The morning rush of tourists had passed, leaving only scattered visitors and the occasional umbrella bobbing between the columns. James stood at his post, expression-neutral boots planted like roots in the stone. He noticed the man immediately, not because he was loud, but because he wasn't. Older, well into his 70s, the man stood apart from the crowd, no phone in hand, no smirk, just a quiet dignity. He wore a dark blue blazer, a maroon tie, and on his chest a single row of modest medals. His walk had a limp, his eyes had seen war. He stopped a respectful distance from James. He didn't speak, didn't gesture, just stood, hands behind his back, observing. Not the Speckle James realized, but the soldier. They held each. The pressure had been building for weeks. After the viral video, James Ellis became a silent fixture of online debates and pub arguments. Some mocked, others defended, but through it all, James remained where he had always been, at his post, boots on the cold stone, rifle in hand, face unreadable. Until the morning everything snapped. It was a warm June day. The palace gates were already crowded by 10mm school trips, influencers, backpackers, and the usual loud voices echoing off stone and steel. James could sense trouble before it arrived. A group of 4 had been loitering by the fencing for nearly 20 minutes, young men in designer trainers and expensive sunglasses, hyped up and restless. They started with loud joking. "Bet he's dying for a toilet break. Yo, do the mannequin challenge." Then one leaned forward and shouted, "Bet you'd never last 5 minutes in a real fight, statue boy." James didn't flinch. He never did, but they wanted a reaction, and they escalated. One pulled a toy grenade from his pocket, cheap plastic, clearly a joke, but he tossed it across the barrier and yelled, "Incoming!" A scream from a nearby tourist. Cameras up, phones everywhere. James's training kicked in. Within seconds, he issued the command, "Stand back," from the guard, followed by a sharp stomp. Nearby police quickly intervened. The object was identified as harmless. The group was questioned, then released. No real threat, they said. But James felt the air shift. Later that afternoon, the story broke. Palace guard overreacts to prank toy, visitors frightened. The footage circulated again. Edited for drama, looping the stomp, looping his shout, looping the laughter, but this time something was different. The public was tired of the cycle, tired of seeing soldiers mocked while doing their duty, tired of watching videos designed for humiliation. In the comments, a quiet tide turned "he's doing his job, what's wrong with people, how is it okay to throw things at soldiers, respect costs nothing." Veterans groups began speaking up, so did teachers, ex-police, even B.C. A popular columnist for a major newspaper wrote, "We ridicule the guards for standing still, but maybe it as us who need to reflect. They serve, they hold tradition. In a world that changes faster than it listens, perhaps they deserve more than just silence, they deserve our respect." That evening, Captain Hartley called James in again, but this time it wasn't a warning. "You followed protocol," the captain said, "and public support's on your side for once. We've been contacted by a BC team. They want to do a segment, humanize the guards. They asked for you." James hesitated. He wasn't a man of speeches, but he said quietly, "If it helps people understand, I'll do it after the meeting." He sat alone in the mess hall. The laughter of younger guards echoed around him, but none at his expense. One of the lads, Connor, the same who'd once asked if he was okay, approached and sat beside him. "You were right to react," Connor said. "If it had been me, I don't think I'd have held my temper." James didn't answer at first. He looked down at his tea and replied, "The trick isn't not feeling it, it's not letting it own you." Connor nodded. Still, they're starting to see now what it really means. James wasn't sure, but something had changed. Not in him, but around him. It was small, but it was growing. The interview aired on a Thursday evening just before the national weather forecast, slotted between local headlines and a soft feature about a dog rescued from a drain. The BBC segment was simple, no grand production, just a well-lit room inside Wellington Barracks. James sat in uniform, shoulders square, voice steady. The interviewer asked the gentle but direct questions. "Why do you think people mock the guards? What goes through your mind when people try to provoke you? What does the uniform mean to you?" James didn't say much. He didn't need to. He spoke about standing in the rain for hours, about the weight of the bearskin, about the responsibility of not just watching over a palace, but carrying the history of a nation on his shoulders. He told the story of young Jack's letter. He mentioned the old veteran who saluted him. And finally, he said this: "We are taught to hold the line physically, yes, but also quietly. Dignity's part of the job. That doesn't mean we don't feel the humiliation when someone mocks us, but I stand there because someone has to remind the world what service still looks like." It wasn't poetic, but it was honest, and the country listened. By the next morning, the tide had turned. The video of his interview spread across social media, shared not with laughter, but with pride. Comments poured in. "Didn't know what they went through. I do now. Apologies to every guard I ever tried to mess with as a teen. Seriously, respect, full stop." A radio host called it the quietest but most powerful interview of the year. One newspaper ran a cover with his picture, the man who stood still and spoke volumes. Even school teachers began using the clip in citizenship lessons. One teacher messaged the regiment directly, "Our students are starting to understand what real service looks like." That man did more in 5 minutes than any textbook, but it wasn't just the public inside the regiment. Something shifted too. Younger guards approached James with a new tone, no longer cautious or amused, but respectful. One lad from a newer intake said, "I watched that clip with my dad. He served in the Falklands. He said you spoke like someone who knows." The commanding officer issued a public letter of support, praising James by name for upholding the finest traditions of the Guard under extreme provocation. He framed it not as an act of self-defense, but of leadership. The next time James took his post outside the palace, something was different. Tourists still took photos, but no one tried to shout in his face. No one mocked. A little girl waved timidly from behind the barrier. Her mum leaned down and said, "He's one of the Queen's soldiers, darling. Very important job." James didn't wave. He couldn't. But inside, something settled. Not pride. Not yet, but something like peace, because for the first time in a long time, he felt seen, not as a figure, not as a meme, but as a man doing his duty, and that made all the difference. It had been 3 months since the video of James Ellis went viral for the second time, this time not for shouting, not for being mocked, but for speaking quietly, plainly, as a soldier and as a man. Public support hadn't faded. In fact, it grew into something James never expected. Understanding, letters continued to arrive at the barracks from school children, from elderly veterans, from former guardsmen long retired, who remembered what it felt like to be mocked for standing still while the world rushed by. James kept every one of them. Not out of vanity, but because they reminded him that service, even silent, eventually finds an audience. The Ministry of Defense invited him to participate in a national campaign about respect for service members. His face was never used. He requested anonymity, but his words were, "Service isn't loud, and it isn't always understood. But it stands, it endures, and sometimes that's enough to change the conversation." Then came the formal recognition. During a ceremony at Horse Guards Parade, before a respectful crowd of invited guests, James received a commendation for conduct presented by a senior officer in full dress. No cameras, no press. Just fellow soldiers and his family watching quietly from the side. His mother wept quietly. His father stood, hands clasped behind his back, a proud glint in his eye. Afterward, an elderly man approached, stooped, decorated, slow on his feet. A retired major. "We've seen many come through these gates, son," he said, "but few stand for something without ever having to move. You reminded people what it all means." James shook his hand, firmly, no words needed. In the following weeks, the tone around the palace changed, not magically, not overnight, but the loud ones. The aggressive pranksters, the mocking vloggers, became rarer. Tourists began to treat the guard with more reverence. Signs were installed along the barriers. The guards are soldiers on active duty. Please respect their service. At first, James thought it wouldn't matter, but it did. People paused, read, reflected. Children now pointed not just at the uniforms, but asked questions: why do they stand there? And got answers rooted in history and duty, not sarcasm. James continued his shifts. The routine remained the same: precision, posture, silence. But inside, something was different. Not in how he stood, but in why, because now when he looked out across the crowd, he saw more than phones and mockery. He saw faces that nodded in respect, children that waved, elders who saluted without needing a response. He hadn't asked for fame. He certainly hadn't wanted attention. But he had earned something far more lasting. Dignity restored. One quiet afternoon, as he stood in his familiar post near the gates of Buckingham Palace, a woman in her 60s approached the barrier. She didn't speak or wave. She just placed a small note at the edge of the rail. Later, when the shift ended, an officer handed it to him. It read, "Thank you. You reminded us what it means to hold the line, not just with rifles, but with decency. The nation saw you, and we're better for it." James folded the note, placed it next to young Jack's letter in his locker, and exhaled. He'd never moved to get attention. He'd only ever stood still to serve. But sometimes, standing still is exactly what moves a nation.